Hello, and welcome to our mock live class today. My name is Kate Deering, Assistant Director of Recruitment and Admissions in graduate online programs within Geese College of Business, and I look forward to spending the next hour or so with you. Our time today will be spent providing you with an opportunity to understand how live lectures are delivered and also for you to have a chance to interact with this high engagement component of Geese Online programs. Geese Online graduate level credentials and degrees are innovative, they're affordable, and they're designed to be fully online to offer flexibility and access for full-time working professionals. Today, you will experience a live session from one of our talented faculty members and be able to get a little bit of a glimpse into what kind of content is shared within Geese Online. Our courses balance foundational material shared on the Coursera platform with an interactive high engagement component as well. The high engagement component includes a 90-minute live class each week and many other facets to learning like group projects or office hours, networking, and also just being part of a great university like Illinois. Before we get started learning about corporate responses to violent conflicts in host countries, I want to cover just a few housekeeping items. I see some of you have your cameras turned on so that you can interact as if this was just a real live weekly class. So thank you for that. Please note that we do have all of you muted in order to minimize background noise during this session. There may, however, be moments when our professor will invite you to participate today, and then our technical team will unmute your microphone for you. If you have any questions as we move throughout the presentation, please use the raise hand feature and we will call on you. I think we're going to have some group discussions today during our live session. In addition to that, we also invite you to feel comfortable participating in the chat. Feel free to interact with the professor and other attendees regarding the live class material. And if you have program questions, save those for a direct email, or I'm going to share a QR code here at the end if you want to get in touch with our recruitment team. So I'm excited to introduce Ishva Minefee, who is an assistant professor of business administration at Geese College of Business. His research primarily examines corporate responses to social movement activism, as well as the financial consequences of those responses. Ishva is also interested in political violence and its effects on firms and their employees. He earned his BA in Global Studies in 2011 from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a PhD in International Business in 2017 from Geese College of Business. Ishva is currently teaching MBA 548, which is global strategy, as well as the capstone for that course, which are both in the global challenges of business focus area within the IMBA program here at Geese. With that, I'm very excited to turn it over to Professor Ishva Minefee.
All righty. Thanks, Kate. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we may all be in different time zones. I thank you all for being here. I hope that you all are doing well. As Kate mentioned, I'm an assistant professor here, and the topic of today, firms, operations, and conflict zones, is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. This is where I do a lot of my research. I've been to a couple of locations and hope to go to others in more peaceful times in the future. So when it comes to this topic, this content for today's session is actually a part of the global strategy course that I co-teach with another professor, and it's part of the political strategies module. And it's really a very engaging session, and I'm hoping that we can replicate some of that in today's session. I'd love to hear from you all, whether that's via raise hand feature on Zoom, speaking out, as well as in the chats. Really just thinking about the high engagement aspects of this course and particularly this program. I'm very much excited to hear your thoughts and responses to this topic and the content that I present today. And so without further ado, I'll go ahead and jump into the overview of the session. So thinking about what we'll cover for the next 45 minutes or so, we'll get into a discussion of why firms operate in conflict zones. Then we'll talk about how firms are affected in different ways by different types of conflicts. And lastly, we'll do a mini case discussion on Lafarge. Lafarge is a French firm in the cement industry. It has some issues during the Syrian civil war in the early 2010s. And so we'll talk about that, have a couple of videos to show, and then we'll get into a larger discussion about what Lafarge should have done, could have done, based upon your perspectives on it. So again, please feel free to jump into the chat, any questions, comments, concerns, and also just to get a sense of where everyone is at geographically, if you can put into the chat where you're at currently, that would be great. I'm currently here in the studio in Champaign. We have a great team assisting with today's session. And just in general, I think the team and leadership for the IMBA program is wonderful. It's excellent. So I'm happy to be a part of it. And so without further ado, I'll just get into the topic for today. What we've seen very much recently over the past year and a half, looking into the media, is a number of conflicts. Obviously, going back to 2022, we have the Russian-Ukraine war, and that's ongoing to this day. We more recently have the Israel-Palestine war conflict, different terms relating to the same thing, very violent situations in both cases. And particularly when it comes to Israel-Palestine, this is something that's been renewed and an ongoing issue that we've seen in the media and across the globe. And you might think, well, this is just a one-off or two-off instances, but the reality is that conflicts are all over the place, unfortunately. And so one organization, one institute, the Heidelberg Institute of International Conflict Research, or the HIIK, where a lot of academics and academicians in international business get their information and data from when it comes to conflicts. They've been tracking conflicts for the past 30 years. Unfortunately, last year, there were, as you all see depicted here, 363 conflicts, more than half of those being labeled as violent conflicts, as depicted in the darker blue to black in the image here. And this is up from a 20-year period from 2003, where we had 218 conflicts. And again, the media may only cover a few, very salient, very recent, very pressing, depending on the country that you're living in, depending on the interaction between different governments. But the reality is that there are a number of conflicts that are going on around us, and that firms are dealing with on a daily basis. Now, we have all of these conflicts, and it becomes a question, well, why do we see so many conflicts? Obviously, there are countless numbers of reasons for why we see conflicts in the world today, be it in particular regions, be it particular countries, and we can get into those. But just a few that come to mind right now and for today's session. First, I think what we've seen over the past decade or so is this shift in government's political ideologies or their values, and whether it's, moving more towards the left, more towards the right, whether it's in the US, Latin America, Europe, we see these shifts. And with those shifts in leadership, shifts in ideologies, this leads to changes in policies, changes in practices, and that might lead to clashes or conflicts between political groups and also citizens, which leads to the second factor here. I think in addition to government's values and ideologies shifting, we often see citizens' values and ideologies shifting, particularly clashing with government's values. And so I think we've seen more of a desire, I'd say more historically over the past 30 to 40 years, we've seen a shift in democratic movements, moving from more authoritarian governments. And definitely over the past decade, I think we've witnessed this in various contexts, which I can get into fairly shortly. Beyond those values, just thinking about resources and where resources may be accessible, who they're accessible to, and the fact that we have a limited supply and access to natural resources. Those who have that access are typically the ones in power. And I think that breeds a lot of conflict internally and externally among groups. And given that there is an unequal distribution of wealth, and I think we've seen that very much historically, often with regards to oil as just one commodity, one resource among many others, leading to conflicts, be it nonviolent or violent. And when we think about these factors that affect conflict or lead to conflict, this leads to different types of risk for multinational corporations or firms. And so a few types of risk. First up, we have transnational risks. So how do events occurring across the globe affect a multinational corporation's operations in a particular location or its decisions to invest in a particular location? And I just give the example of the Syrian war. This goes back to the early to mid 2010s. Given the war, you had a number of individuals who left as refugees, moving over to Europe. And this, according to a number of analysts, a number of governments, led to a migration crisis. And for multinational corporations, it became an issue. Well, do we hire these individuals? We may hire immigrants at home, but do we hire them? We're a US firm, for example, operating in Germany. Are we going to support the German government's mission and values towards hiring immigrants? And so for some, this could be seen as a risk. Are you going to do so? What are the consequences if you don't, socially and politically? Secondly, thinking about regional risk. Different political shifts across regions definitely affecting firms in a variety of ways. I'll give one example here, the Arab Spring. So Northern Africa, the Middle East, in the early 2010s, starting in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, other locations, this shift of individual citizens, some would say fed up with governmental corruption, governmental biases, and governmental laws, leading to violent conflicts, leading to a push towards new leadership. And we saw new leadership in a variety of countries in the context, in the face of violence. And with those new leaders, well, what would that mean for firms, for multinationals operating in those countries and in those locations, losing those political ties, losing those political connections? How do you start up anew if you were tied to the quote unquote regime from before? And so we saw that, we've seen that over time. And lastly, this notion of the local and country risk. I think we often see conflicts that are very much spread across a nation, spread across a country. And while those are affecting all firms in a different time, different locations, we can think about the fact that some risks are very much localized. So they're in a particular region within the country, in a particular city. I just give one example here, the Niger Delta Avengers. They consider themselves fighting back against oil-based firms in Nigeria, such as Shell and others, basically bombing their pipelines. This has happened over the past decade or two. And they're very much located within the southern region of the country, more southwestern. And so when you think about all multinationals, not all multinationals being affected because this is more localized. And so these are just a few types of risk that firms confront, but yet and still, firms are taking the decisions, making the decisions to invest in these types of countries. And the question becomes, well, why? And so to get into some engagement for the course, that's where I want to open it up for us, for the audience. Just your thoughts. Why do firms even invest in conflict zones? What would lead them to do so? And if you can use the hand raise feature, that would be wonderful. Love to hear from you when it comes to this particular question. Any thoughts about it? Yep, Devin?
Yep, maybe because it's still cost effective or cheap to operate in those countries.
Thank you for that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The cost comes into play if it's still beneficial. And you can think about that from where my resource is located in this particular place, how much would it cost to shift or move them to other locations? That could be a factor. So cost benefit analysis in that regard. Thank you for that.
And we do have one hand raised.
Yep. TS. Oh, you're muted right now.
Okay. Sometimes firms may take advantage of the infrastructure in the conflict zone. Things are happening and they try to take benefit out of the infrastructure that's laid out there or available there during the conflicts.
Yep, absolutely. I think it's one of the biggest critiques against multinationals operating in these types of locations. Are you simply just taking advantage? Are you engaging in power plays, one group relative to the next, simply to extract the resources, extract the wealth from these particular locations? And I actually have an example of that towards the end of class, actually two examples. One, we'll see that some would argue in the context of Lafarge in Syria, but also a resource or a suggestion, information piece that I'll give to you all towards the end on one firm operating in this type of context. So thank you for that point. Any other thoughts about why would firms even invest in conflict zones? I'm sure there are a number of risks. We'll talk about those types of risks, but any thoughts about why?
Sometimes firm may get governmental support because a lot of other nations are coming to support those conflict areas, and they're trying to provide support for the local people. When I'm an investor and I'm going and telling the government I'm going to invest there, then all the government is going to support me for my goals.
Yeah, completely agree. And there are a number of types of support that governments can give, along with other organizations. I didn't have this on the next slide, but we think about, well, political risk insurance has become a big business, big industry over the past 30, 40 years or so, at least in the US. But if I believe that my assets will be insured, I'm willing to stay or I'm willing to go invest in these locations. Additionally, if I believe that my home government is supportive, then I'm willing to go. So thank you very much for that perspective. And that kind of leads to the first point that I had, a few points here. But again, belief that you're going to be supported by your home government. And particularly, we've seen a lot of bilateral investment treaties or bilateral trade treaties as well when it comes to firms desiring to enter into locations. If I believe that my home government is going to engage in conversation or engage in potential sanctions, or at least ensure that my assets will be protected, then I'm willing to invest in these locations. Additionally, if I am a firm that's been operating around the globe for the past 30, 40 years, we've come across a number of conflicts. We decided to stay in through many of those conflicts. I have experience with conflicts, such that if a conflict breaks out, I know what to do. I have the best security protocols, or I've even hired security, but I have the strategic capabilities to be successful, still maintain my performance levels at a high rate. I'm willing to stay. I'm willing to invest. And I'm also going to be following what my peers are doing. So are others in my industry or in my home country, are they deciding to stay? Are they deciding to go? This notion of mimetic isomorphism. We will essentially follow the group, follow the band, and stay or invest in a volatile location. And it comes down to, well, why am I there? Why do I want to go? In general, we think about the emphasis on shareholder value. If it's beneficial, if it's still going to be profitable at the end of the day, yes, I'm going to go. And lastly, again, there are a number of reasons why firms would invest in conflict zones. Sometimes this is just where you have to operate. And we think about natural resources and firms in these particular industries. Well, many of the world's resources are geographically bound, and unfortunately, they may be located in and throughout particular conflict zones. I just give you one example with regards to oil. We've seen, think about a number of contexts listed here, be it Russia, be it Iran, be it Nigeria, Libya. All of these places have had conflicts in one way or another fairly recently over the past 15 years or so, and even more historically. But this is where the oil is located. So do you go? If there are no sanctions from your home government, then you might be more willing to go and to stay. And so those are some of your reasons for investment. But thinking about the implications, and this is where I want to spend the rest of the class in discussion. There are a number of implications. First, it comes down to social implications. So I just give one depiction of 4 contexts where you've seen calls for divestment, calls for firms to exit particular locations given violence. So whether it was, I've done work on South Africa and apartheid, or the systematic segregation between whites and non-whites in the country for over nearly 40 years, more than 40 years, and particularly with regards to the divestment campaign, more so starting in the late 1960s to 1990. Myanmar, or Burma, you had a repressive military government in power. And even more recently, we've had a coup in Burma leading to violence. Israel, more historically beyond 2005, and definitely today with renewed tensions and conflict between Israel and Palestine, we see that some activists consider this to be an act of terrorism when it comes to Israel engaging in violence with Palestine. And one particular organization, BDS, boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, calling for firms to leave. And similarly, with regards to Iran, you've also seen this with Russia in regards to the Ukrainian conflict. And so from a social perspective, you have your potential for your reputation to be damaged if you decide to stay in these locations. And if you decide to invest, while others are leaving, you might see this as an opportunity to go, but the potential trade-off is damage to your reputation. Now, beyond reputational damage, there are financial costs. There might be human-based costs. And so this leads to our mini discussion with regards to Lafarge's operations in Syria. I have 2 perspectives on this. One from the French government, Lafarge basically funding terrorists, funding ISIS to stay in Syria in the early 2010s. So what happened in France, its home country, but also what's happened in the US. And so I'll ask the studio team to go ahead and give us these 2 videos. The first one, roughly 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and the second one about 4 minutes. And this will lead to some open discussion for us. So for the studio team, we can go ahead and get that going.
So all that's still ahead, but first, France's top criminal court of appeal has ruled against one of the country's largest companies over its role in the Syrian war. Cement maker Lafarge continued to operate in northern Syria between 2012 and 2014, despite the threat of armed groups, including ISIL, in the region. It's also accused of being complicit in crimes against humanity and so-called terror financing. Natasha Butler is live for us with more on this. So, Natasha, what does this ruling mean?
Well, it is a blow to the reputation of the French cement maker Lafarge. Just to give you a bit of context, in 2019, a court of appeal in France ruled that Lafarge could not be investigated for complicity in crimes against humanity over its actions running its plant in northern Syria at the height of the civil war there. But today, judges in France's top criminal court of appeal have overturned that decision. Now, that effectively paves the way for Lafarge to possibly be investigated in the future for complicity in crimes against humanity. However, it's important to note note that this is just a step in the process, and another court in the future will have to decide whether or not Lafarge can indeed be investigated for complicity in war crimes. Now, this is all linked to Lafarge's decision to keep its cement plant in the north of Syria running between 2012 and 2014. It was an ISIL-controlled area. Activists say that Lafarge was fully aware of the risks and dangers to its employees because it actually evacuated its foreign staff but left its Syrian workers to keep the plant running. Some of those died at the hands of armed groups, including ISIL. And Lafarge is also accused of paying armed groups, including ISIL, some $15 million in protection money to keep the factory running. So it is also under investigation currently and has been since 2017 for financing terrorism. Today, judges in the court said that investigation can continue. Now, Lafarge has in the past admitted some mistakes. It has blamed some of its executives in France have blamed executives in Syria for actions in the country there, but it has denied many other allegations.
Natasha, thank you. Natasha Butler, live for us in Paris.
Thank you for that. And we'll go on to the second video.
News out today that a French company has pled guilty and paid more than $750 million in fines, resolving a U.S. federal criminal charge that the company made payments to ISIS and another terrorist group to keep a cement plant operating in Syria. That was in 2013 and 2014, as ISIS was kidnapping and killing Westerners. The company, Lafarge, paid more than $10 million to the terrorist groups. Our Eamon Javers is here with Deputy U.S. Attorney General Lisa Monaco on the news. Eamon,
Sarah, that's right.
How on earth does this happen?
So good to see you. And Lisa Monaco, thank you so much for joining us. And
thanks for having me.
Sarah's question is a great one. How on earth does this happen?
Well, what we've seen today is the first time ever that a corporation has pled guilty, has been charged with and pled guilty to providing material support to terrorism, the most notorious, one of the most brutal and notorious terrorist groups this world has ever seen.
They were sending
ISIS.
just cash checks to ISIS
They're
in order to be able to do business in Syria?
They're paying ISIS for protection and for muscle, but also to undercut their competitors, to get a business advantage. They were making a business decision, but it was not a decision that was theirs to make. It is against the law to pay money to a designated foreign terrorist organization. That's ISIS here. And this was happening all the time in 2014, the summer of 2014, at the same time that ISIS was brutalizing the Syrian people and killing, murdering innocent civilians, innocent Americans, journalists, aid workers. So this is a truly horrific case. And what we've seen here is, frankly, a cautionary tale to companies, multinational companies doing business as they are every day in this very complex world today in high-risk environments. And boards and CEOs need to be very vigilant about their companies operating there.
This was personal to you, though, because during these years, or some of these years, you were running Homeland Security for the United States. Did you have any idea that a French company was paying ISIS at the same time you and the rest of the U.S. intelligence community were trying to put a stop to them?
No, we didn't, Eamon. And this was, as I said, in the summer of 2014. ISIS is marauding across Iraq and Syria, waging a horrible, brutal engage in a civil war in Syria and undertaking the most brutal acts of terrorism, both in the Syrian people and against Americans, innocent Americans they'd kidnapped and murdered.
Do you think global corporations are making the same type of decisions now? I mean, we've got Ukraine, you've got all sorts of conflict zones around the world. Are companies deciding on a business basis to be in business with terrorists now?
Look, this is what we want boards and CEOs and general counsels to take away from this case today, which is that now more than ever, companies are operating in high-risk environments all around the globe. Boards and CEOs and general counsels need to be hyper vigilant about those operations. They need to be really paying close attention to doing deals with companies, with other companies operating in those environments. They need to be doing due diligence. They need to be investing in compliance structures so they can detect this type of activity and report it to the government.
Now, the initial reason we had scheduled for you to be here at the NYSE today was to talk about cryptocurrency, because we've got a big documentary on this fascinating couple that you arrested and charged earlier this year with money laundering more than $3 billion in allegedly stolen Bitcoin. Heather Morgan and Ilya Dutch Lichtenstein. You seized more than $3 billion worth of currency earlier this year. Can you tell us what's going to happen to that currency?
Yeah. All righty, so stop it there. Thanks for that, for the studio team. And so when we think about this case of Lafarge's operations in Syria, these date back to the late 2000s. They essentially engage in an acquisition to start their investment there. Things are successful, but then a war breaks out. They decide to stay and decide to make these payments to ISIS leaders. And so this leads to a number of questions. That I'm just curious to get your thoughts on this. So open question to the class. Who do you think is to blame for these decisions, for the decision to stay? Any thoughts on this? Yep, Devin, thank you.
Yes, just a question. Do we have any idea how much profit did Lafarge generated during that period of operations? Just to have a better picture.
So it was not stated, but I believe it was in the tens of millions of dollars. I'd say approximately 40 to 50 million. This was one of their largest operations across the globe. But the specifics never came out. And so we can talk about, well, how did this issue come out? It was more so an investigation into the firm, and then emails were leaked to the press. This comes out. But as far as these specifics on numbers, I've seen dozens of millions, tens of millions from a profits perspective.
So is it correct to say that they didn't have a net profit after paying the fine to the US?
Well, if we fast forward it to 2021, 2022, essentially when the fine comes out, absolutely not. Okay. In the sense of from this particular operation, yes, the firm is still in business to this day, but the reason why they were charged in the U.S. is because they have operations here in the U.S. They actually have a plant and some operations in Chicago. And so by being traded here, SEC, as we saw with the fine, I guess that leads into the second question listed here, some of the consequences, financial consequences, nearly or a bit more than $750 million. Yep.
So your question was, who's at fault?
Yep. Any thoughts on that?
I would say whoever's in charge of government relations for the company and not having secure process and protocols in place to keep an eye out for who they're doing business with, and even what are the checks and balances above them from the like the chief operating officer perspective, if that's the alignment. But I would say that would be the vertical for me. Government relations and whoever is in charge of operations for not having controls in place or systems to check and monitor.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kevin. Absolutely. I like that notion of the checks and balances, particularly when we think about the headquarters and the subsidiary. And you had the director in Syria, again, according to emails that were exposed, engaging in conversations with folks at the top. But folks at the top said, let's keep the operation going. We don't want to lose this particular plant. Someone else may come in, or ISIS may completely take over the plant, and we may not be able to get that investment back. There's definitely a mix of the two, subsidiary and level and the headquarters.
How about the stockholders, investors, right? I go and invest on this plant, and this had happened, but I need to take my investment back, and I want this plant to be going on, continue the operation, right?
Yep. Thanks for that. Yep. And so at least during the time, 2012 to 2014, a lot of the investors simply did not know. At least that's what is or has been portrayed in the media. Your general stockholders, investors did not know. But fast forward to 2016, 2017, when this comes out, it then becomes a choice for investors to divest their holdings in a particular firm. And I think we've seen this. I gave you all a few examples of South Africa or Burma or other locations where we've seen once the conflict is readily apparent, and once a firm's operations in a conflict are readily apparent, stockholders, shareholders make the choice to continue to invest or to divest their stocks. So definitely have a role after the fact. And so I would say that's one of the consequences that we see for these types of decisions.
If I may just add one more point, the question creates a little bit of bias because it's written who was to blame. Then one thinks about the person, but I want to put another idea forward. Maybe what about company culture and values, because they are also important in making such decisions. What's in the DNA of the company? Are they chasing just profit, or they have some value regarding I don't know, human lives being killed there?
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Devin. And I think in the fuller discussion I have about this particular case, we do get into discussion on, well, in general, when it comes to conflicts. I can't necessarily speak to the organizational culture at Lafarge, although a lot of individuals in the media, when this case came out, their critique was that, Lafarge executives are all about profits. So that's why they stayed. And so that's part of the culture. But in general, when we think about multinationals operating in these locations or deciding to stay, even in the midst of controversy, even in the midst of human lives being lost, and some blaming the firm for those lives being lost, it comes down to, well, performance metrics. And it comes down to shareholders. What do we think our shareholders want? They want to make profits. They want to make money. And so if this is our money maker or our bread and butter or one of our largest operations, then we need to continue with that. And I completely agree. That definitely can tie to the corporate culture.
How about the government policies? Okay, I'm on mute. So how about the government policy which failed to see the cracks or did not monitor the money flow, etc.? Will they be?
Yep. Are you referring to the French government's policies or the Syrian government's policies?
The French government policies.
Yep. When it comes to corruption more broadly, and also we think about terrorism financing, like the US, the French government very much has laws on the books for, well, if you get caught with terrorist financing, these are the consequences. You get caught engaging in corruption in some form in a foreign country, these are the consequences. I simply don't think that anyone really knew what was going on. And that's largely because if I'm an executive at Lafarge, I'm probably not going out and telling one of the ministers in France, so this is what we have happening in this context. And so some would say, is it the French government's fault? Is the French government to blame? Maybe less so relative to the executives at Lafarge.
I just want to have a question continuing T.S.'s question. How can a company hide like a payment of around $10 million in its financial statements to ISIS? How is it even? I mean, they must have been probably the company is listed in Europe, or I suppose France, the mother country. So there must be some securities organization or overseeing organizations in France who are checking the financial statements of the company, even of the plant operating in Syria. So how come they didn't notice such a big payment?
That was, it was very much mentioned again in the investigative reports that, well, I think we see this with fraud in general in I'd say the playing with of numbers. I think we saw a little bit of that. There's also some checks, also some cash payments. So again, is cash just simply missing and not noted correctly? It was the case. And so no one was necessarily checking for this. And I think we've seen that in other contexts. Like, I'll give an example of Firestone's operations in Liberia in the 1990s. There were $2.2 million in tax payments to this warlord. Well, it was written off as, well, these are Social Security, pensions, and funding in that regard. And so I think it comes down to how you categorize the payments, or simply falsely noting what the numbers actually are, which was the case for Lafarge. Yeah.
So the accountants were to blame.
Yeah. Oh,
basically.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a way of putting it. Yeah. There are some accounting errors, some would say, to put it bluntly.
I want to add one thing that I noticed. As you mentioned, this is a warning for the general counsel, right? So I think it's start with compliance department, how they're monitoring program, how that, like even the business development team able to vet them as potential business partner, and not, there's no flag there to move forward that business transactions. And then, like mentioned before on the financial statement, assuming they're publicly traded company. So how is the audit process? Like even the audit partner that auditing their financial statement, and also the disclosure on their financial reporting, how is that not mentioned there or not being got there?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a part of the problem. You mentioned compliance and monitoring and auditing, and were these systems in place in a strong and, I'd say, beneficial manner is probably not the best language for it, but in a secure manner when it comes to like, oh, we're doing this in a diligent manner, doing this by the books. I don't think we really saw that in this particular case. And it makes me think of, at least in the US, like Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations. And I think we have this general assumption, like, yes, everyone in all of these firms will have great monitoring systems, great compliance systems. But the reality is that they don't in a lot of locations, whether that's coming from the top or coming from a particular subsidiary. We still see violations to this day, and it's due to a lack of strong auditing. And so I think that's something that needs to be addressed in these types of situations. I thought I saw one hand. Is it Sashiel?
Yeah, that's correct. I think I was just thinking, coming from a global company, I know that we have a lot of systems to make sure that all employees are compliant with global relations. And so I think at first it was easy for me to blame the cement company, but then I thought about, well, as a government entity, what are the mutual agreements that are being monitored when it comes to doing business in places where there are conflicts? And then also as the individual company, how are you upholding those agreements? Whether it's your legal team or the CEO making those decisions, it seems like blame is complex. And so it was hard for me to figure out where, because it seems like both sides are to blame, but obviously the company took most of it.
Yeah, thank you for those points. When it comes to governmental entities along with the firms, and to that point on, like, who upholds these agreements? Is it just, oh, we put this in our annual report, yes, we are going to abide by this particular code of conduct at the company level or at the country level? Is it just rhetoric? But again, in reality, the practices are very much decoupled or separate from what's actually being said, versus what's actually happening. So thank you for that point. And so when it comes to, yeah, it's agreed, very complex. Like, who's to blame? Is it, again, headquarters, subsidiaries, governments on both sides? And when it comes to that particular question, we are still seeing individuals currently, they're facing criminal charges. So more so within Europe, particularly in France, less so in the US. In the US, it was more so the financial penalty, as we saw depicted in the video. But open question of, will these folks be criminally charged? And it's more so folks at the very top in this regard. And when it comes to consequences, yes, financial, social, reputation definitely took a hit, but also, of course, and some would say the most important is the human cost. Employees' lives were lost in this regard. And so beyond those questions, the next question, I know we're running very low on time. I know Kate wanted to leave some time for open Q&A, so I'll make this next one very quick. The question becomes, what could have been done? And so we do have a poll. If I can ask the studio team to go ahead and launch the poll, what should Lafarge have done in this situation? Maintain operations, completely terminated operations, or suspended operations temporarily in Syria. So just curious your thoughts on that. Like 10 more seconds.
Gotcha.
Then yeah. Anyone else? All righty. So thank you all for participating in the poll. Literally, essentially neck and neck between terminating and suspending operations. And so I know we don't have the time for this, as you see depicted here on the screen. What I would do in a standard class is I would actually lay out your responses and then continue the open discussion. Given that we are running low on time, I'll just ask really briefly any quick comments for those who chose completely terminate your operations. What was your rationale for that decision? If anyone wants to jump in and take that.
Reason for my choice was because it's a historically volatile region, and if you consider that, looking forward to the future, I think it's beneficial for the corporation to move out of there as quickly as possible and find a new operating region.
Thank you for that response. Hopefully I got your name right, Jaite.
But yeah, you can call me Ted.
Tay, gotcha. Thank you for that response. Yeah, I like the notion, like, historically volatile. It's not just like, oh, this just happened, but if we think about Syria over the years, is this the only conflict that firms have witnessed within this particular context? And if we think about various countries, various regions, there's a start and stop, start and pause type of reality when it comes to conflicts. And the conflict life cycle is a thing where you might have some periods of peace, but peace is in a lot of cases temporary and short-lived. And so if it's been this way for a number of years or decades, which we've seen in other countries in the context, maybe we just need to get out completely and go elsewhere. Take the loss, some would say. So thank you for that. For those who chose suspend operations, any thoughts on this?
I think the suspension of operations is kind of the bare minimum that you have to do just to get started. And clearly there was a thought process that went into it because they removed the Western workers and left the local workers. So in order to protect and do the bare minimum of safety, they needed to suspend operations and protect not just the Western people, but the local as well. And then do an evaluation of, is there going to be some point in the future at which point we can restart operations, or is this something that we're going to need to completely abandon?
Yeah. Thanks for that, Matt. From a process perspective, you can make a decision, suspend. We would hope, this is going to be a short suspension. Obviously, we would likely monitor the situation. We've got our French expats out. Are we going to do anything for local Syrian employees and their families or the communities that we serve? Is there something that we could do there? And then, to your point, absolutely, over time, you make that decision to maybe we withdraw, we just stay suspended. Yeah. TS, did I see you unmute? Is there a comment? If not, no worries. So again, we could definitely spend more time with this. I know we don't have that time, short class. I appreciate the engagement with this particular case discussion. And so someone say, yes, absolutely, we're not going to maintain operations. Do not do this. There are various factors that could influence both the decision to withdraw completely and to suspend operations. And I think we've seen a mix. If we think about Russia, Ukraine, we think about Israel, Palestine, even more recently, we do see some firms, at least in Israel, Palestine, suspending operations and continuing on. With regards to Russia, Ukraine, we see a mix of continuing on, withdrawing, and suspending operations. And so, no, we are very much at the end. So final remarks. I think the reality is that we will continue to see conflicts, unfortunately, and they will continue to affect firms' operations directly and indirectly, whether it's in the same country, same region, or even across the globe. To get back to that notion of transnational risk, still affecting your operations indirectly. It's often unavoidable considering the industry that the firm operates in, and particularly when it comes to industries where we have natural resources. I give the example of oil. Do you simply try to move elsewhere, or do you try to develop the strategic capabilities to handle those types of conflicts when they come up? And lastly, I mentioned an information resource, something I would very much encourage everyone to check out. Yeah, we often do not get the experience of expats in these locations. It's very much, one, we barely know what is going on, unfortunately, in these types of contexts. And so it's a matter of, are there investigations? Is there exposure? Are there emails that are given to investigative journalists? But we really don't get the notion of, well, how do expats deal with this? One documentary goes back to 2014, has attempted to capture this, Firestone and the Warlord. I mentioned Firestone, American tire manufacturer, its operations in Liberia in the 1990s. Some would say very controversial, very much problematic. And the decision to suspend their operations and make these controversial payments that no one really knew about. Folks had heard of it, but no one really knew about. And there was no monitoring really of these types of payments to this particular individual here, depicted here, Charles Taylor, the Warlord. And this is a free and publicly available documentary. I've shown the documentary in the MBA class. A lot of students really enjoy this. This is something you can check out on your own in your free time, 80 minutes. It is very graphic, but it's very insightful as it gives us some insight into the consequences of the costs of doing business in conflict zones. And with that, I will stop there. I know we are running low on time. And so are there any final questions about the class, the content, or just the structure of the program? If we have some time, Kate.
Yes, we definitely have time for a couple questions if anybody has any. It's okay if you don't, too. It's a Monday morning, right? It's a little early.
I do have a question. In terms of like engagement, when the classes are much larger, is there a hand raising portion? Are we in breakout groups? Like, what does participation look like in a much larger setting?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I can speak to that from the perspective of the global strategy course. I've taught it twice. There have been class sizes of 550 individuals. We have a morning session and an evening session, so that breaks it down. So you won't have everyone in one session. And additionally, although the live sessions are not required for attendance, they are strongly encouraged. And I think that's one of the best aspects of this program. And so we've often had 100, 125 people on Zoom in an evening session for my co-taught class. And it goes really well. So you do have the hand raise feature, speaking out just like this. You also have a number of individuals giving their comments in the chat, which is completely fine. I might show a video. I'm sure other instructors, professors show videos as well. And sometimes there will be a full breakout room where there are 4 or 5 attendees and classmates that will be discussing a question. I've had breakout rooms as well, then bringing it back to open discussion. So very much like a classroom, just in a virtual setting. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I'll say that I think the IMBA program is great. I know I'm biased. It's been a fun experience. Teaching in it. So I teach the global strategy course every spring. Very much a lot of fun having interactions and engagement. I also, as of last year, started teaching the capstone course, which is a 2-week course that covers content from the 3 courses in the specialization: strategy, marketing, and multiculturalism. Also a lot of fun over those 2 weeks. And from the feedback I've gotten, a lot of people really enjoy the MBA program and this structure, this setup, depending on where they are. As I mentioned, I say good morning, good evening, good afternoon to start all my classes because folks are really coming from across the globe. So I highly encourage it. And I'm more than happy to share more. If Kate gives out my email, I'm completely fine with that if you all have questions about this.
Perfect. That is a perfect segment into our closing. I just wanted to say thank you, Professor Minefee. This was great. And I love that you just shared your email. That is one, or that you would. I think our faculty members are so approachable and just really great at working with our students. So thank you for that. But we really appreciated your insight. I feel like today's conversation was really current and just a great glimpse into one of our focus areas, within the program. So I hope everyone enjoyed this live class experience, and really thank you for your comments and your participation in the chat. That's what makes these learning environments really, really great. So we hope you learned something and you're inspired to possibly submit your application possibly in the future. The next deadline is December 7th if you'd like to start in the spring. So a January or a March start in either the MBA, MSM, or the MSA program. We would like to offer a special application fee waiver since we do have a fee currently that is required. So if you do apply here before this next deadline, you can use the code JOINGEESEJAN24, and I'll go ahead and send you that in a follow-up email for your attendance today. But otherwise, thank you so much for being here. You know where to find us if you have any questions. And again, thank you, Professor. I know this was a new venture for you, so you did great. Thank you so much for hosting everyone today, and everybody have a great rest of your week.